Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, business continuity, COVID, resilience, anything that's relatable to those topics. Speaking of topics, if you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. Reach out to me via LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. You can send me a message. YouTube, you can leave a comment, or on Voice America, there is a button underneath the graphic on the webpage for the show that allows you to send me an email as well. And I do respond to everything I get. So please feel free to reach out. With regards to YouTube, don't forget to check out the Preparing for the Unexpected YouTube channel because there are some shows there that don't appear on Voice America because they're shorter or they're longer in some cases. So don't forget, check out Preparing for the Unexpected on YouTube. As always, every month, I always talk with my friend, Regina Phelps. Regina, welcome back.
Alex, it's a treat. It's February already. We've been doing this. Has it been a year? I think it's been a year, right?
It
It has been.
actually,
In
I think
March.
this is the 13th episode that we've talked about, mostly on COVID.
13. Wow.
So
Lucky
yeah, because
13.
we talked about it before the WHO created or declared, I should say, pandemic, and
Hmm.
we were talking about it in China and what might happen if it came over here. So we've been talking about it for a long time.
Yeah, go by fast, doesn't it?
Fast, and yet it feels so long.
It feels so long. Yes, it feels like deja vu every day. Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. And what can I say? But it's a delight to be with you as always. I have lots of things to talk about as usual.
Oh, I know. Sometimes I wish we did film or record our opening talk, because we always end up talking for 10, 12 minutes before we start recording. So,
Yeah, I know. I know. We should do that. Sometimes just start recording and just don't tell me, and we'll just get into it.
yeah, we'll do the whole show that way.
Right, right, right. The surprise show.
Well, let's jump right into it. What's the latest that you have from COVID? Where are we?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I suppose, or fortunately, I'm not sure how you look at it, but we are recording this on the date that the United States has reached the really grim milestone of 500,000 deaths here in the U.S. And so it's kind of a solemn time, and I want to say that it's only been 30 days since we were at 400,000. So we have added 100,000 lives lost in just 30 days here in the United States. And so it is a reminder to all of us that I know that this is long and grueling and difficult. But there is a lot of people suffering way beyond what you and I might be suffering who have lost loved ones and are really trying to cope with loss of life, loss of health, loss of income, and lots of struggles. So I know that overall everybody wants to get back to their life, but we can't do that. And for all the reasons that 100,000 on top of another 100,000 on top of another 100,000 and so on reveal to us, and that we are frankly, Alex, really stuck in this pandemic until the vaccination rate globally really is going to get to be somewhere in the 70%. So yes, indeed, maybe we'll have more, well, certainly not herd immunity, but we'll have a lot less disease transmission in countries once it gets to be in the 70% range. But it also is a time to stop and reflect that until every country has a large number of people vaccinated, this disease will continue to threaten every nation, every person in the globe. And that's because anywhere in the world where there's an outbreak or where there's limited vaccination, a variant can spin up, just like it did in Brazil and South Africa and the UK. And somebody contracts that illness, gets on a plane, and next thing you know, they go to Toronto and it starts all over again. So
And it's happened.
yes, yes, and we have to talk to ourselves and kind of remind ourselves of this enormity of this, but at the same time the humanity of it. And I don't know about you, but for me, the 500,000 deaths number is big. it's painful. And I spent a little bit of time today sort of grieving about that. And I think it's important that we all recognize our own humanity and that we need to stop and, have some sadness about what's really going on, and then, collect ourselves and move forward. But I think it's critical to spend some moments grieving too.
I think that's an interesting point because I felt that way when I saw the number today too. When I turned on the news and looked at the number, and I felt like my heart sank. Like,
Mm-hmm.
couldn't we have done better?
Right. Right.
And I don't just mean the United States. I don't want to, pick a political fight here or anything, but just seeing that number in itself, couldn't
Mm-hmm.
we have done better? You know,
Mm-hmm.
d- wasn't there something we could have done? Well, obviously there was. We know there was,
Right.
but didn't we realize that we would have such an impact on people,
Mm-hmm.
by denying, ignoring, or
Mm-hmm.
taking our time to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
500,000, that's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people.
And
I mean, think of how many cities
that's
you
one
have that are
person.
that size, right?
Yeah,
In
that
Canada.
each number represents one person. But one person, let's say, has a partner, or children,
Mm-hmm.
grandparents, or
Mm-hmm.
parents, depending on who it was. So let's say
Right.
another 10 people. So you could say up to 5 million people,
Mm-hmm.
just timing that number by 10, have
Mm-hmm.
been impacted,
Right. Right.
and their lives will never be the same. That's huge.
Right. It's huge. It's huge. And I think it's important to have that moment to really just acknowledge that, and not to bemoan it, I suppose, but to just let it in, because otherwise I think that there's an important grief has an important role to play in any of this, whether it's your own personal grief about losing somebody, or kind of the more country or global grief. So I think it's important just to reflect on it. So I think that's a big deal here in the United States. I think globally, what we're seeing is really a big drop now in numbers and cases, pretty much, in a majority of the countries. And there's a lot of speculation of like, what does this mean? Now, I want your listeners to reflect that vaccines, for the most part, have only been available for the last 60 days, and in many countries, hardly at all, if at all.
Mhm.
And so people might say, well, gosh, is it the vaccines that are making a difference in the drop of the numbers? And the answer is no, it's not
Yeah.
the vaccines. The thing that you want to look at is there's a variety of reasons why the numbers are dropping so much, but a couple of the big headlines is that, first of all, we had really huge numbers to start, right? So as we were, going through the fall season of gatherings, Thanksgivings between Canada and United States,
Yeah.
though our numbers were going up and up and up. And then we got into that about 4-week period of holidays and all of that. And the numbers just exploded because there was just way too many gatherings of all kinds. And it took a long time to churn through testing, hospitalizations, and deaths. And now we're sort of coming down off a gigantic wave of all of those holidays. The other thing I will say to you here in the United States is our testing numbers have really dropped for some reason. People are not getting tested. So maybe our case numbers are still higher than they are, and they're high. I mean, they're not low. They're in the 60,000s a day.
Any idea why the people aren't getting tested as much?
That's a really good question. Now, there are some people that say, if they're interviewed, that they don't want to get tested because either they don't want to know, or they don't want to be having to quarantine, or they don't want to have to tell their employer. So there's some people that have that kind of feeling.
Hmm.
I mean, there's more testing available, but people aren't getting tested. So that's another part of the issue. So we have a big drop from a big surge. We have less testing overall. We have about, depending on how you count it, around maybe 25% or so, 30, maybe a percent of the nation that's been sick and had COVID. So that will help slow transmission a little bit. And the last thing is that, frankly, here in the US, people are finally, until maybe the last week or so, been pretty good. I would say most people are better masking. Now, because of the variants, people are double masking.
Mhm.
And I hear my friends who live all over the United States saying that they're seeing more responsibility, where people are behaving more appropriately. Now, in the city I live in, We have the lowest death count and lowest case count of any large city in America. Our death count's about 380 now, 380 persons. And our case count's only about 35,000 in a city of 900,000 people. And we're all squished together in San Francisco. We're not spread out like some large, expansive property in Texas or something. And so what we have is that people are here around in my town, people are really good, but many communities in the United States, not so much. And so I think people are more compliant now. Now, I will say to you that very recently, there's several governors and mayors who have removed mask mandates, which they have the legal authority to do. And so people are becoming, oh, I'm tired, I'm burned out. You know, the other thing is that here in the United States, they're starting to open up restaurants and bars and gyms, and our case count, Alex, is still high. It's in the 58 or 60,000 today, as an example. And so I'm super nervous about that. So it's a weird kind of mix, but we have not achieved herd immunity. We're not going to get to herd immunity, if we're lucky, until the late fall. So what we're seeing in the drop is numbers is not vaccines, and it's not herd immunity, unfortunately.
The same thing is happening here. I don't think anyone is in lockdown anymore. And if they are, the ones that I do know are going to be opening up next week, but they're going to be opening up slowly. I think the last time we talked, I gave an example of some teenagers that were walking around my neighborhood that I saw all the time, no masks. Well, now I'm seeing everybody wearing a mask.
That's good.
All of a sudden, I don't know if it was the same group, of course, but a group of teenagers were walking by and everyone had a mask on now, and they were moving off the sidewalk as I came through with the dog, or I went off the sidewalk. Everybody had a mask now. I think I mentioned there was a party at the university here.
A super spreader event, wasn't that?
Yeah, a super spreader event. We're not hearing that anymore. Nothing like that's happened because everybody got ticketed, or some people are actually now getting fined, $1,000. And, from what I've heard that, courts and everybody, they're not even going to talk to you about, if you want to fight the ticket. It's no, too bad. You're paying it. So all of a sudden, I'm not seeing a lot of those stories anymore either. Because people know now they are being held accountable for what they're doing. And our hospitalizations, deaths, new cases and active cases are all going down. And I'm still a little nervous with having things open up. I only because we went through it before. Numbers went down, and everything opened up, and then all of a sudden, we had a bigger wave. I know we've got. I don't know about the States actually. I haven't heard this, but in Canada now, if you are traveling and you're flying into the country, before you can even get on the plane, you have to prove that you have a hotel at your destination, because you have to quarantine there for 2 weeks. From the airport to the hotel, you can't go anywhere.
You guys are good that way. We're not that way. We should be, but we're not.
Well, that only just came into effect, and a lot of us are kind of looking at each other going, why didn't you do that from the start? Maybe we wouldn't have had some of these cases that we've got.
But
the
only thing they're doing in the US is if you come from another country, you have to be able to present that you have a positive, negative COVID test.
Yeah, you have to do that too. And they've already, I've heard that a couple of people have already been fighting it because they were sent back saying, no. And there is now, I saw one article last week about fake slips. Criminals jumped on that right away.
Yes.
You can now buy fake slips and, get into a country or travel or whatever the case may be.
And that's where, I think people often take that idea, Alex, and then talk about the idea of immunity passports. But the idea would be on your phone, right? So you'd actually then be able to show it. But, oh my God, talk about the ability for hacking, fraudulent passports, fraudulent apps. And so I think that, even though that sounds great to be able to say, gee, I got vaccinated, or my test is negative and I can go to a concert or get on a plane or something like that. But, how will we be able to ensure that app or that passport is actually legit and not a fraud, and that you are actually indeed vaccinated, or you just really got a negative COVID test? There have already been cases busted in Europe of rings selling, negative COVID tests documentation.
Yeah. Yeah. It didn't take them very long to
Didn't
put that
right?
together, did it?
No, not
Yeah.
at all. Not at all.
Jeez. And then there's the, I just had it in my head. Um, our border is still closed to the United States, actually, land border,
Well,
except
and actually,
except for
a lot of the
key
cities in
goods.
the U.S. are unhappy about that because they get a lot of revenue from Canadians who are coming to the U.S. It's a
But a
big
lot of
deal.
Canadians don't want to go to the US right now.
Well, would you want to go to the disease central of the world?
I love going to the US. I know you and I have touched base in Phoenix, and
Yeah, yeah,
I've
yeah,
been
yeah.
to other places, and I love going to the States. But right now, with the way things are, I don't want to get on a plane. I don't want to
Right.
go somewhere where I don't know what's happening.
Yep.
There's
Very smart.
it's too risky,
Too risky.
for me and for others.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and on that, we've actually come to the end of our first segment. We're having our monthly chat with Regina Phelps about all things COVID related. And just as a side note, for anyone knows, and for Regina, it's the first time we've actually met our 16-minute first segment time limit. Would you believe? Celebration.
I
We'll
guess
be
that
right.
means we're trainable, Alex. I didn't know that was
I guess
possible.
so. We'll be right back. And we're back talking with Regina Phelps about all things COVID. So, Regina, we're hearing a lot of stuff about the variants lately.
Mm-hmm.
I even heard on the radio that one of the variants has now become another variant that
Mm-hmm.
came out of it. And that's Brazil, UK, South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening with those?
Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about the variants because it's fascinating from a scientific perspective and creepy from a living perspective. So let me just talk about variants for a moment and the current science about where these really difficult and nasty variants are coming from. Many of these believe, and in some cases are actually traced back to a person. And what they've discovered is that these individuals were these pretty nefarious variants are coming from were either immunocompromised, so perhaps a cancer patient or somebody with some compressed disease got ill, and their immune system was having a very difficult time fighting it off, even with medications, et cetera. And so because the person was infected for such a long period of time, the virus had the opportunity to constantly keep trying and reinventing itself. So in those individuals that are immunocompromised, that's one place where the variants have come from. The second place they've come from is actually people of either that has received particularly convalescent plasma. So convalescent plasma, which is one of the therapeutics that are given to people in hospitals, if the antibodies in that plasma isn't quite strong enough to kill off the virus, it puts up a position where that virus can keep retrying and retrying and retrying. And in their efforts, they reinvent themselves. Now, the way that they actually can trace this back to actually a individual rather than just happenstance is that the sheer number of mutations in these big variants that have been released. So normally a variant might have one or two mutations and maybe it's able, I can pass it to you, but it's not very good and it doesn't get much farther. These more sophisticated variants that have come from these immunocompromised people or people who have received convalescent plasma have in some cases between 17 and 23 significant mutations. So the virus just kept reinventing itself and changing. Well, does this work? Does that work? It becomes more and more adaptable. And then if it's able to successfully exit that person and actually infect somebody, that's where the problem begins. You mentioned one that variant that had changed already, and that is actually the UK variant. In the UK variant, in the UK, there's actually been documented cases where the UK variant has mutated again, and it now has mutations that are similar to the South African variant. And why that particularly would be deeply concerning is that the UK variant, the B117, is more infectious, more transmissible, and a little bit more deadly. The South African variant evades vaccine and therapeutics. So you marry those two together, it would be a bad thing. That's only in a very few documented cases. So if that really did take off, it would change everything.
That would be worse than what we've got now. Could be
Right.
worse than what we've got.
Right. And so the B117, which is now in the United States, actually all of the variants are in the United States. P1, which is from Brazil, and B1351, which is from South Africa, are all in the US. So the UK variant, the B117, is actually doubling every 10 days here in the US. And the big concern about that, Alex, is that many of the infectious disease doctors and epidemiologists that I work with believe that as it continues to spread and find more and more people because of its infectious nature and the fact that it is more deadly, what's very likely to happen is that now we're going to have probably about the middle of March, we could be having, spike number 4 here in the US. And why it's concerning is because, as we talked about in the last segment, where not everybody's wearing a mask, and there's some places that are relaxing those things, and they're opening up stuff. So the numbers are coming down, so everybody feels really good, but the variants are coming up. And so, there's this chance where we could actually be coming down from the highest high and then start back up again to be at even a much higher position than we were just a while ago. So that's a big issue in the US. And the variants are going to be a big issue worldwide.
Is that why there's talk of wearing 2 masks now?
Yes, double masking. So, and I'm glad you said that. So in this, I hope this doesn't happen in Canada, but so many people, when they wear a mask, either a surgical mask or a paper mask or a cloth mask, it's not tightly fitted, right? It's got little gaps. And so when I wear surgical masks, that's my mask of choice. And so I have a smaller face, and I have to kind of tuck them so that they actually fit well. I've been double masking for maybe, 45 days. So I wear a surgical mask, which has good filtration. And then I wear a cloth mask on top of that. And that gets me a better seal around my face. An N95 would be a great thing, or a K95, but those are not easy to find. So double masking it. And actually the CDC is recommended now, especially if you're in an area, if you were to go on a plane, let's say, and you couldn't get an N95, you would want it to be double masked. If you're going to be standing in a grocery store line, you should be double masked. Because remember, this is an aerosol driven illness. So it's not just what you see that's in the air, it's all this aerosol that you can't see. And if you're inside a building for any length of time, you have the opportunity for exposure. So double masking is the way to go. And especially with B117, which is very transmissible.
Now, I also heard something about the variants, if they do, hope not, knock on wood, take off, that we could be in this pandemic as a result of it till the end of the year, into 2022. Is that kind of likely, or
that would be that's highly possible.
Or is that scare tactics?
No, that's actually highly possible. Because remember, if the variants are not if the vaccines aren't as effective with the variants, you can vaccinate a lot of people, but you are not going to have a match. And that's the big issue. So pardon me, for the B117, it still works. The vaccines still work against it. The ones that are of bigger concern are the P1, which is from Brazil, and the B1351, which is from South Africa. Those have significant changes on the spike protein, which is where the vaccines are aimed at, and it does reduce the efficacy of those vaccines. Now, there's one study I will tell you that actually scared the hell out of me, and this was actually, it's been documented very well, and any of your listeners want to look up Mencos, Brazil. And there was a lot of articles about this, but there was one very recently in the Lancet, and I'm happy to send you a link if you want to put it in the show notes for this.
Sure.
So Mencos, Brazil is a 2.5 million population town right out of the outskirts of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. So 2.5 million people. In the spring, March, April, that community was devastated. There were so many people who were sick and dying from COVID. They had people dying on the streets. They had mass burial graves. It was a horror show. Now, over the course of our summer, their winter, they actually it got under control, and it began to dissipate. They did, scientists went in and they did what are called seroprevalence studies, where they checked the antibodies of a large number of residents. And they discovered, to their shock, that about 75% of the 2.5 million people had antibodies, which means they had been sick. Okay, so that's the baseline. Now, starting in November, P1, the Brazilian variant, took off in Mangus, Brazil, and it is doing exactly the same thing right now. It is killing large numbers of people. They have ran out of oxygen in hospitals. They are treating people on the street. People are, it's exactly the same thing. And that is horrifying to think that all of those people got sick. And now a new variant came out and all of them are now vulnerable again. So that's the kind of thing you hear something like that, and it makes me sort of sit back in my shoes. And it's not just a casual observation about this. It's been documented extensively by very significant and reputable medical journals. And it's frankly terrifying. But I will send you some links to that because your viewers might want to read about it.
Yeah, that would be great if you could send that when we finish talking today, and I'll include that in my notes. Has anything changed? I'm curious now, based on that 75%. The Brazil variant that you were talking about. Has anything changed on how COVID and these variants are affecting children? Do you know?
Yeah,
Because
that's
I know
really
we
interesting.
talked about that once before, and I'm wondering if there's been any change on that.
There's been just in this last week. So one of the syndromes that a child may get is they might get a multi-inflammatory, multi-organ inflammatory disease. So they get COVID, it may not even be that significant, but what starts to happen is they develop a variety of significant medical issues, and it's a multi-organ inflammatory response where it's infected just about everything in their body. And so they go into a hospital and they have just tremendous illness. They have started to say, originally there wasn't that many cases of this multi-inflammatory disease in children. Now I believe we're up to several hundred now. And so there was just several articles this last week about more serious illness in young children by simply more numbers. Now, is it because we just have so many cases and that's why? But traditionally or historically, children have not had significant illness with COVID. However, there has been this increase in this multi-organ inflammatory disease. In the 500,000 deaths in the United States as of today, 225 of those were children. So the numbers are very, very small, but there is this shift that's happening, and that's something that I think we need to just continue to watch. And you'll see that written up in a variety of medical journals in this last week.
And I guess I'm assuming correctly, unfortunately, that the variants could actually have an impact on that, could change those numbers, right? That could be one of the triggers.
And I think that's the big takeaway for your listeners is that, I hate to be the one that can't ever produce the best news here, but the scary thing is that the variants have the potential to change all of this. And I think we got lulled into a lot of complacency because even though the virus is constantly mutating, there were no big significant releases of these viruses that had really transformed themselves, as we've seen in the last 90 days, 120 days. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, I think we were thinking like, whoa, we get the vaccines and we're home free, right? Like, woohoo. Well, that's not the case because the vaccines and the variants have to match up. And if they don't, this pandemic will continue to drone on for a lot longer than we would like.
It could have been if the variants didn't show up, right? We could have, it's just like business continuity planning. If you have a disaster, you plan a certain way, hope everything goes the happy path. And if we had just COVID and the vaccines, we would have had a happy path and eventually see the light at the end of the tunnel. And now we see variants coming along that are kind of, oh, no, slow down. Right. Not so happy path.
Right. You thought you had us, huh? Not so much.
Yeah. So you've talked about vaccines. What's the latest with vaccines? Because I think there's still really only two key players right now, Moderna and Pfizer.
Right. Those are the two ones that have gotten emergency authorization in most countries. But Johnson & Johnson is right on their foots. And so here in the United States, the FDA is having a meeting regarding the Johnson & Johnson vaccine on February 26th. And I would imagine, within a week after that, they're probably going to get an emergency use authorization, assuming the data is what they've been releasing by press release all pans out. And so that will be a third vaccine. Now, the good thing about that vaccine is it only requires one dose. It's not quite as effective. It's in the 80% versus the 95%. But many times people say to me, if I get a chance to get a vaccine, but it's the Johnson & Johnson, I really want the Pfizer, should I skip it? It's like, no. You get a chance to get a vaccine, you get a vaccine.
Take it. Yeah.
Regardless of what it is. So there will be more vaccines coming over the course of the summer. But I think we're kind of spoiled by the messenger RNA vaccines. Not only were they the first to market, but they had such high efficacy rates. Perhaps others will have that same efficacy, but certainly right now, Johnson & Johnson looks like it's in that 80 percentile. The other thing I would say to you is that you might have been hearing recently that based on the variants, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine require 2 doses each, 21 or 28 days apart. And there's recent studies, Pfizer in particular, is that after the first dose, or about the time you're waiting for the second one, that amount of effectiveness can rise up into the 90s. There has been some discussion here in the United States among infectious disease doctors and epidemiologists is because of the variant here in the United States, doubling every 10 days, the B117, that maybe the best thing to do would be to not give a second dose, but to take that second dose and give it to somebody else. And then the idea would be you could vaccinate while this variant is ripping through the country. You have the possibility to actually potentially save more lives because the people would at least all have, especially the older folks, above 65, everybody could get vaccinated by April if we did that. And very likely that would probably save a lot of lives if B117 follows the path that most people believe it's going to, which is a gigantic surge.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another thing that's people are chewing on right now. But if they don't make a decision soon, it won't matter because that needs to happen now.
And we know how long it takes for to get decisions
right.
at high government levels and things like that.
Right.
And especially in the U.S. where you don't have a single governing agency like at least we do in Canada, even though it's not perfect. We at least have one health agency we can all turn to.
Right. Yeah. Here in the United States, it's not that, as you well know, at all. Right. Yeah. Which makes it much more difficult.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We are talking with Regina Phelps today, and we will be right back. Welcome back. We are talking with Regina Phelps today about COVID, the latest happenings with COVID. Regina, I think there's a little bit more we want to talk about some of the vaccine, and that's the rollout, right? How are things going with the rollout? I know things have changed in the U.S.
Yeah, so certainly in the U.S. it has changed immensely. Now we actually have a plan, and the federal government's really doing a lot to assist with administration. So it's moving along. I wanted just to share with you some of the data, and I would say to all of your listeners, if you're curious about what's happening in vaccines, not just in your country, but any place in the world, if you go to Bloomberg, there's many free sections of Bloomberg, which is an expensive website, but all of their pandemic documents are free. And they have a very excellent vaccine tracker, which actually monitors vaccine doses worldwide, both first and second doses. And it's really excellent. So if you're trying to scope out what countries are looking like, I would really encourage you to go to that site. I wanted to say that when you look at that site, the number one country for vaccine administration is Israel, which is actually vaccinated 78.8 doses per 100 people. That's pretty impressive. And they've actually administered 47% has gotten the first dose and 31% have gotten 2 doses. And these are, the 2-dose vaccines, right? And what they're starting to see in Israel is now a decrease in transmission because they have such high vaccination. So that's something that all of us can look forward to. Here in the US, we are 1, 2, 3, we're like 6 down, and we're at 19.3 for doses per 100 people. You're a fair nation. I love Canada, but you're really slow on the vaccines. You're at 3.97 for doses per 100 people, right? So as I mentioned earlier, until we really get widespread vaccination worldwide, this threat is not going away. Even though your country might be doing very well with vaccines, if travel, which of course will happen, we are still going to have the opportunity to have a disease introduced into our countries and issues related to variants. I want to give a shout out in my country. Interestingly enough, the state that has the highest vaccination rate is Alaska, which is kind of shocking because Alaska is a very large state and extremely rural. And for
Mhm.
them to administer vaccines, maybe like in the Northern Territories, they could do it by float planes, ski mobiles, snowshoes, and skiing. And they actually have teams. I've actually heard interviews with some teams that usually about 10 people. I heard a team of all women, like 2 physicians, 2 pharmacists, and the rest were nurses. And they basically go into a village, they fly in, snowshoe in, whatever it is, and they vaccinate the entire village. And then they go back out and they do exactly that same thing. But that with that kind of effort, they have actually been able to really vaccinate a large number of people. So I give a shout out to my Alaskan colleagues for all of their great work. And then interestingly enough, the American territories, Guam, American Samoa, and Palau have all gotten vaccines at a high level, right below Alaska. And then our next state is New Mexico. So that's the top 5 in the U.S. Alaska, 3 territories, and New Mexico.
And I think ours here, the top ones are our 3 Northern Territories,
Right.
Northwest Territories, Yukon, Nunavut, and I think our smallest province. Oh my God, Prince Edward Island.
Yes,
Oh,
right,
almost
right, right.
forgot. I'd have all
Actually,
these.
that was in Bloomberg too. I saw that. So what I would say to all of your listeners, if you get a chance to get vaccinated, take it. Don't debate about which vaccine you're being offered. Any of them are good. Some are slightly better than others. It does not matter. It's going to stop you from having serious illness and dying, and very likely stop you from getting the disease. So take any vaccine that comes your way. Do not hesitate at all.
Yeah, if you're thirsty, a half a glass of water is better than an empty glass, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And we need to stop this pandemic. We need needles in arms.
Yes.
That's the only way this is going to stop.
Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about today is the return to the office stuff
Mm-hmm.
that's going on. I'm seeing a lot. You and I had this chat before we started talking today, and I was getting a little wound up, I think. but
You,
I'm,
Alex? Really?
me, yeah, yeah. I'm seeing a lot of webinars, and I'm going to be attending a few over the next few days of on the topic of returning to the office, what organizations need to do. And I'm getting the feeling that in a way we haven't learned some lessons from our experiences. It's all from the perspective of the organization. We want people to come back to the office, and we're going to send out communications. This is what we want you to do. And yet for the last year, organizations have all been saying that we're most concerned about our people. Yet it feels as though right now that one aspect, people, isn't being incorporated into anything,
Mm-hmm.
because for the last year, people have been working at home. There is a new way of getting through the day for people. I know people that are happy because they get to see their kids in the morning now and send them off to school, or they're home when their kids come home. They're getting to spend more time with their families. It's not for everybody. Granted, I don't want to make it seem as though everything's a rosy picture, but for many, there are some who didn't thrive in the office, but are now thriving working from home.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people that are ecstatic, like I would be, not having to take 2 hours of commuting time in the morning and 2 hours back at the end of the day. That's gone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having that, which gives me a better work-life balance. And now organizations are suddenly coming along and talking, saying, well, now we're going to get everything back the way it was before. It feels like we haven't learned anything, and we're not addressing what's really going on.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of thoughts do you have?
Well, what I would say to you is a couple of things is that here in the States and in most communities that we have clients in throughout the United States, none of them are going back at this point. And I think the general consensus is that people originally thought they might be able to go back in the summer. And I think as soon as the variants really began to shoot up, and that sort of has changed the entire dynamic. Most of my clients now are looking and praying that they might be able to reopen offices probably in the fall. Many of them have actually already looked to the winter of 2022. Now, what does all of that mean, and what do we need to think about? I agree with you, Alex, that if we have gone through all of this hell for the last year plus, and we haven't learned anything, meaning we haven't found that some really positive things out of all of this misery, and we go back and do what we've always done, I would say, frankly, shame on us.
Hmm.
What have you been doing? So many of my clients, I know, I've talked about this before, have really embraced this concept of reinvention, and that the idea is that many of my clients are actually now really seriously beginning to look at what this really means to them. Do we need as much office space? Many of them, the vast majority, in fact, it's not just me talking about this. I mean, I've seen McKinsey has done multiple studies about this, that many employers are looking at a hybrid model, which would be something like, 2 or 3 days at work or 2 or 3 days at home. And that could also change if your job can be done effectively at home and you don't have a great need for collaboration. Maybe you'd be at home more days. But I think the idea is that a more forward thinking organization is going to look at this as an opportunity. Frankly, for them, if they can actually have the work done well and not have as much office space, that's a big saving for them. Many of my clients with call centers have already decided they're not reopening those things. They might have a small group of individuals so that if there's power outages or issues where people couldn't operate out of their homes, they don't go down. But many of them are not bringing call centers back at all. And so I think it takes a more forward thinking executive, perhaps, to really ask the question, what did we learn? And why do we go back? And this is what I
Mhm.
also would say to anybody who's working with an executive team and they're really saying, well, let's go back, let's go back. And the question is, why are we going back now? And I want to remind you, because of the variance, I think this is a huge issue. You should not be thinking about going back now. And maybe what you should be doing is planning for the fall. By then, we've got probably enough vaccine out in the community that if the variants haven't ripped off and changed a lot, maybe we could have a chance of going back successfully. But I think the thing that we need to sort of dance in our mind with are three key things, and they all start with the letter V. Vaccines, we've talked about. Variants, we've talked about. The third thing we haven't talked about is the V of ventilation. This is the big deal. Offices are indoor spaces. That
Mhm.
requires that we have excellent ventilation. Another site I would like to suggest to your listeners is the Healthy Building site from Harvard in the United States. There's actually really, believe it or not, in the Department of Public Health, a division of Harvard that started about, I think, 10 years ago, and it's all on healthy buildings. I mean, don't you think they're having a moment now? Oh my God.
Mhm.
And a lot of their research has been around, this is way before the pandemic, is about ventilation. And so what they talk about is, and all their studies were done about just overall wellness, overall decrease in illness. This is before the pandemic. Now they've done a ton of other studies related to COVID. But clearly, there are several things that have to happen for you to be able to open an office, have people come back, and be safe at work. Because frankly, if people don't take care of the ventilation question, you're going to have to go back, and frankly, it's going to be like you're working at home, although you had to drive to work. You can't have meetings in a conference room. You're still going to be wearing a mask. You can't really go to a break. They should close all the break rooms and not have people sitting in a break room with a mask off eating. So, okay, you start, and that's what I always push on people. Do you understand what this means? So that's the first thing I would say is that, do you understand what it means right now, today, with the limited number of vaccines that are out, the number of variants that are out, and the number of cases that are out? You're going to drive to work from home. Now, the other thing I want to go back to about the ventilation, because this is really important for your listeners, is that there's a lot of research done about ventilation. And they know that from a ventilation perspective, to really minimize aerosol transmission. Remember, what is COVID? It's an aerosol transmitted disease. You must have in your air conditioning system, your HVAC, an air exchange of 4 to 6 air exchange per hour. Now, How many ventilation systems have 4 to 6 air exchanges per hour? Most businesses have 1/2 hour to 1 hour exchange routinely. For you to get to 4 to 6 exchanges per hour, sometimes the ventilation system is not robust enough to turn that much air in that period of time. So many companies here in the States have already been realizing they had to change and upgrade their HVAC because it does not move the air sufficiently to get 4 to 6 air exchanges an hour. The second thing you have to have with ventilation is you have to have good filtration. What does that mean? You want to have what's called a MERV 13 filter. That's a HEPA filter that will remove most very small aerosol sized viral particles. So you get 4 to 6 air exchanges per hour. You get a MERV 13 filter. And the last thing you must have in a safe ventilation system for COVID is you need humidity at about 40 to 60%. And many times the air exchanges and all of that in most buildings, it's very dry. COVID likes dry air. So if people are going to go back to an office, I want you to talk about ventilation. Tell me, what are you doing to make that safe? It's not just limiting the number of people in an elevator and having one-way hallways and making everybody wear a mask, blah, blah, blah. It's the ventilation system. And the other thing is that even if people have their own individual office, they think, well, gee, I can have my mask off. Well, maybe not. Because what happens with the air? Where does that air go? It's going to go into the ventilation system. And if you really might be transmitting COVID, you're now sending it through the aerosol, and it's going to live for a while. It's going to go down the hallway. It's going to drop into somebody else's office. So you got to dig into the HVAC system in a really big way.
Yeah.
And for a lot of offices, that's not going to work because their systems are too old.
Yeah, and we've got less than 2 minutes. The last thing I just wanted to say is the reason why I wanted to bring that up is right now there's a big concern about employee well-being and their
mental
state.
health, right?
And yet we're all of a sudden, or not we, but organizations are all of a sudden, well, now this is what we expect of you. It's as though they haven't learned that or realized that there are, it's not just sniffles and colds, et cetera, that COVID is showing. It's impacting the well-being of people. And that aspect seems to have been forgotten.
Yeah.
And not.
I mean, if people are rushing to get back, I would say that is the case.
Yeah.
And this is really what your listeners have to take away from this conversation about going back to work. Answer me the question, why are you going back now?
Yeah.
Why are you going back now? If you've been working at home for 12 months, why are you going back now when it's still so dangerous with the variants?
Yeah. And that's the perfect spot to end this month's show. Regina, it's always a pleasure chatting with you.
My friend.
I enjoy our talks every month, and I'm already looking forward to next month just to see where we are, what's happened then. So thank you very much for your time again. I appreciate it.
Alex, always a great pleasure.
And to everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.